So we have arrived culturally at this place where it's seen as offensive to care about men because it's seen as caring about the group of people who have way more privilege than everybody else and therefore must be doing way better than everybody else. But the reason why people think that men are doing better than everybody else is because nobody's actually paying attention to them, besides like Warren Farrell, Richard Reeves, and Jordan Peterson. Because if you were actually to begin paying attention to the state of boys and men right now, you'd realize really quickly that there are a lot of very deeply serious issues facing men and boys right now that are not being prioritized in the way that they need to be. Social justice has kind of turned into this us versus them dynamic, and it's now seen as a zero-sum game. So caring about men is now seen as turning your back on women. And that is just such an incorrect way to look at it. If you care about women, you have to care about men. Because our success as a community, as a country, and ultimately as a species is inextricably linked. So we're going to be talking about some of the ways that our culture dehumanizes men, and one of the ways that we do that is through our language. This is kind of the formula that I've identified for anti-man rhetoric. So first we identify that there is a small population of men that are engaging in a similar behavior with malicious intent. We're going to take that behavior, we're going to label it, and then greatly broaden the definition so that we can accuse all men of engaging in that behavior. And if a man attempts to explain the context of his behavior or the reasons for his behavior, we'll invalidate anything that he says by accusing him of either being a misogynist or an oppressor. And if any woman attempts to provide context or explain that behavior from either the man's perspective or from a perspective that's not squarely centered in the feminist line of thinking, we will invalidate anything she has to say by accusing her of having internalized misogyny, and then we'll call her a pick-me, which implies that the only reason that she's speaking about this issue is because she is craving male validation. Because the only reason that any woman could ever care about men is because they crave male validation. I mean, I should know. I'm Gabby, welcome to my channel. Today we're gonna be talking about mansplaining. And I wanna actually think deeply about it. Why does mansplaining happen? When might it be the case that a man explains something to someone, usually a woman, in a manner that may be considered condescending? So one of the ways we could explain this behavior that we call mansplaining is through the lens of neurodiversity. It's very common for people with ADHD or autism to struggle following social cues when they're speaking to other people, and that can lead to them struggling in social situations. Like, if you spend an extended period of time with me, you're gonna learn very quickly that I have very severe ADHD. And I mean, I've spent like a good decade learning how to manage my ADHD, and I also work with it a lot in my clinical practice, so I'm really familiar with the mechanics of the condition, and I understand how it's best managed. But despite all of that, it is still the case that when I get really excited, it is very difficult for me to read and follow social cues. And sometimes that results in me talking over people or interrupting them or over-explaining something without stopping to be like, hey, is that something you should explain, or is that something that they probably already know? And my over-explanation is never meant to be condescending. It's just that when I get excited, I struggle with self-awareness. And that is a very common symptom of ADHD and autism. And I'm realizing, as I'm sitting here thinking about mansplaining, I'm realizing that if I were a man, I would probably be accused of mansplaining all the time. Because if we look at the definition, we can see that the man's intent doesn't actually matter. The only thing that matters is how it's perceived by the person on the receiving end. So by setting this precedent that anytime a man explains something in a manner that could be considered condescending, we should chalk it up to sexism and label it mansplaining, we have made the world a lot harder for men who struggle with ADHD or autism or may have other social difficulties. And it's also the case that men and boys are more likely to have ADHD and autism. And they're also more likely to struggle socially since we begin teaching them how to repress their emotions from the time that they're literally a newborn. So it becomes difficult for them to ever have healthy and meaningful relationships, but we can talk about that later. So I think that the intention of this term was to make people aware of this behavior so that they can call out sexism. And maybe that did help diminish some of the original bad behavior that's done with malicious intent. But the other thing that it's done is it's sent a lot of hatred and intolerance toward boys and men who struggle to socially communicate, potentially because they have autism, ADHD, or struggle socially for other reasons. And a lot of men really don't have a lot of social support right now. A lot of men are struggling with loneliness. And seeing men just dismissed or shut down when they are making a genuine attempt to connect with somebody is very heartbreaking. So I think that a really great place to analyze more of this behavior that we call mansplaining is on the golf course. I have been a golfer for my whole life, and it's usually the case, it was especially the case when I was younger, that whenever I was on the driving range or at the practice screen, a man or two would come up to me to usually explain something. And there are a few different types of flavors of men who do this. And there are absolutely men who will explain something in a condescending way. And it's very obvious that they're attempting to belittle me by explaining something rudely or saying that I'm doing something wrong, even when I know that I'm not. I would say that those men are intentionally creating a hostile environment. And I hate that flavor of explaining. It makes me not want to be at the golf course anymore. But that version has happened so infrequently that I vividly remember every time that it's happened. And I think that this specific flavor of explaining could actually be considered sexism. This specific situation is what I think the definition of mansplaining was intended to be, and it should only mean this specific behavior. Because there are some men who use this as a tactic, especially to women, to bully people and make them feel uncomfortable so that they leave. It's just a below-the-belt way of creating a hostile environment to communicate to people that they are not welcome in that environment. And in these instances, the intent actually is malicious. So what happens far more often in that situation is that some random man will come up and offer advice or give a little tip or a suggestion or feedback on my swing. And when I was in high school, that drove me absolutely insane because I was on the golf team and I didn't need any unsolicited advice from random people. I took it as them thinking that they knew better than me or were assuming that I didn't know what I was doing. But now that I'm older and I have a little bit more perspective, I can think differently about that situation. Because if I zoom out a little bit and I add some more context, I think about how a lot of those men who would approach me to give me guidance reminded me a lot of my dad. My dad is an amazing golfer, and I think to him, my first par might have been more exciting than my first steps. And he was so excited when I joined the golf team that he would follow behind me at meets and practices like 30 feet behind with like the little binoculars, just watching all of my shots. And on the drive home, we'd go through each of the holes and talk about what went well and what I needed to improve on. And I think a lot of men just really love golf and they get excited to see a young woman training. And I think sometimes that excitement comes out as, oh my gosh, I know a lot about this and I want you to embrace this sport. So I'm going to give you this information that I feel will be useful to you. But men doing that and looking out for women isn't something that just happens on the golf course. That happens a lot of places. And I feel like we only ever hear about men who aren't accommodating to women or men who are outright exploitative of women. And like we should hear about those things, but we should also be hearing about stories where men are going out of their way to help women, to be inclusive to them because they want to see them be successful. And there are so many men like that. That protectiveness and genuine desire to help others is an extremely masculine trait, but we never hear about the positive interactions of men. And because it's what we hear about more often, we're biased toward thinking that the negative explanation is correct more often. When in reality, I think that the positive interpretation is the more correct explanation a lot of the time. And so if we look at my little anti-man rhetoric model, we can see that the definition has been made way too broad. And the issue is that sexism actually does exist. But if we're saying that everything is sexist, then nothing can be sexist. We run into the Sinjin. What's that guy? Who's that guy from The Incredibles? Who's that guy from The Incredibles? The Sinjin problem? We run into the syndrome problem. That's what it is.
Everyone can be super. And when everyone's super, no one will be.
If everything is sexist, then nothing is sexist. And then we can't actually identify actual sexism. So it's actually way worse for women to over-attribute all of this male behavior to sexism. It hurts men who are actually speaking to women with good intention. And as for the men that are actually sexist, they don't care what women think of them. So they don't care if women accuse them of mansplaining anyway. Women got what we've been fighting for. We now have an equality of opportunity in the public sphere, which means that there are now a lot of women entering historically male-dominated spaces. And it's created kind of a hard situation for good men who genuinely want to help women. And this is a way of thinking that I would have never thought about before. Because there's a really strong feminist idea that's like, we want to be treated equally. Treat us exactly like you treat other men. And the problem with that is that if men communicate with women in the way that they communicate with other men, it's very likely that they're going to be accused of mansplaining. Because men have a typically more direct style of communication. They typically give each other information without stopping to be like, how would this person feel about what I'm about to tell them? They just say the information. But on the other hand, if men modify their language so that they can be more accommodating of the feminine style of speech, there's a word for that in gender studies, and it's called benevolent sexism. And benevolent sexism is still seen as sexism. It's still bad. So here's my suggestion to men as a defector of radical feminism. I think that the best thing that you can do, whether you are a man or a woman, is to start practicing thinking about some of these issues on a more individual level. Seeing things as men versus women is not good because it's never an accurate way to view the world. So when we see men as all good or all bad, or women as all good or all bad, that's kind of like seeing the world as all good or bad. It's always going to be both. But all that being said, even if intentions are good, someone explaining to you something that you already know, regardless of their intention and regardless of their gender, can still be annoying. But the way that we manage that behavior is the way that we should manage any other behavior that annoys us, with respectful communication and boundary setting. I had a boyfriend once who truly loved to explain things to me. And sometimes it was really helpful, but sometimes they were like deeply obvious things that I obviously already knew. Like once, I swear that he explained fish to me when we were at the aquarium. And it got to a point where his explaining became nails on a chalkboard. So we sat down and had a conversation about it, and I explained to him how when he explained things to me that were just common sense, it made me feel like he was speaking down to me or that he thought I was stupid. And he explained how sometimes when he gets excited, sometimes his excitement just comes out as over-explaining. And he explained how a lot of times when he's explaining something to me, it's an attempt at connecting with me. So we aligned ourselves so that we were on the same side of the argument. I think that it's really important when we're arguing with people that we love to make sure that we recognize that it's not you versus them, but rather it's you and them versus the problem. So at the end of that conversation, we came to this agreement that he would start phrasing things as questions rather than as statements. And it took us a minute to get to a place where he could do that pretty consistently, but it ended up totally changing our dynamic. We met in the middle, and he was willing to commit to being more mindful of the way that he spoke to me, and I was willing to commit to practicing patience by recognizing that the reason he is explaining lettuce to me is because we're making dinner together and he loves me. In theory, feminism is supposed to be a movement that works toward the equality of opportunity between men and women, but it blames literally every single social problem on men. And one of the issues with that framing is that it's not conducive to healthy relationships between men and women. I think that it's time to move toward a post-feminist egalitarian movement. Because men and women need to actually work together now to determine what we want our relationships to look like now that they're not as stringent of gender roles. Men and women both suffer, but right now only one group is allowed to talk about it. And if we only care about certain groups and actively ignore or even celebrate the suffering of others, then we aren't fighting oppression. We're just creating a new form of it. Men and women are not enemies, and the real divide isn't men versus women. It's people versus bad ideas. And one of the worst ideas that we've embraced is that men as a group are the problem. And I'm not here to defend bad men, but I refuse to pretend that all men are bad. They aren't. And if we want a world where men and women can both thrive, we have to stop pretending that they are. Because here is the main issue with the term mansplaining, even in the way that I believe it's intended to be used. This isn't a male behavior. This is a human behavior. It's so silly to think that men are the only people who speak down to people to make them feel unwelcome. And I think it's so silly that we've blamed so much negative behavior on toxic masculinity, as if masculinity is the thing that corrupts character. Evil is not a male trait. So many modern feminists see being cruel to men as David throwing a stone at Goliath. And as a result, this distorted lens has visually shielded them from the current crises of masculinity that we see in our society. But men versus women is not David versus Goliath. And I don't think a lot of women are realizing how hard of rocks that they've been throwing at men. Women have been taught to identify men explaining anything to them as sexist. And many women actually don't realize that men communicate differently than women. So in a lot of cases, they don't realize that their anger is misdirected and that the men that they're talking to aren't engaging with them in a way that's intended to make them feel bad. When someone is genuinely trying to be kind to you, it's totally appropriate to set clear boundaries with them respectfully, but if their intention is good, we don't want to spit in their face. In an attempt to not be bullied, we don't want to become the bully. I think the change that we need to make on the women's side is recognizing that sometimes men do things that women find annoying. just like sometimes women do things that men find annoying. We should be really careful about looking at men explaining things as oppressors looking to oppress, because the power difference between men and women used to be stark, but it's much less so. And my personal anecdote here is that since I started YouTube, you guys don't understand how many people have come out of the woodwork to give me so much advice. And so much of it is just so deeply unhelpful. And it's not gendered. I've gotten really terrible advice from men and women, but they're just trying to help me, and I can see that. It's still annoying, but that's okay. We're animals. Animals annoy each other. You just heard my dog bark over there, and I'm actually going to leave it in the shot because it's a good example of my dog annoying me. Animals annoy each other. Not every behavior is a personal or gender-based attack. And to drive that home, I've scoured the internet to try and find a gendered equivalent of mansplaining, so let's watch this together.
We've all heard of mansplaining, but allow me to introduce you to she-laborating. It is when you ask a woman a very, very simple question and she sits you down and gives you a 30-minute answer.
Was this whole video me she-laborating? That's embarrassing. But I hope you at least enjoyed some of my she-laborating, or I gave you some food for thought. And if I didn't, we can sit down and have a respectful conversation about it, because that is how interpersonal conflict should be handled. That wraps up this video. If you want to follow me in my quest of learning how to think about the world outside of the feminist lens, I would love to have you. And we already know that the theme of my channel is going to get me called this name so many times. So I'm going to capitalize on it and say that you should pick me by liking and subscribing to my channel.
So pick me. Choose me.
Subscribe to
me.
And I will see you guys in the comment section.